Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to your second flip super early in the morning. It's like 7:15, and I'm trying to motivate myself to get this thing after and get going. But the good thing is that we are going to be talking about something I find ridiculously interesting. So, also a big thing as well. Great day today in class. Or not today in class, yesterday in class. Yesterday in class, you had a phenomenal day. We really understood everything going on. We talked about all these different ideas and all these different misconceptions about exploration by the Europeans. But now we're moving into what is considered a Spanish conquest, right? So we had the Treaty of Tordesillas drawn by the Pope, the line of demarcation that split the world in half. And so now you're going to have the Spanish that are going to be having a base of operations in the Caribbean, and they're going to be using this foothold to spread out into Mexico and other areas of the like, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is that they have heard or do know of several other people that are on the horizon, right? They have heard about the people like the Aztecs, the Inca. They've also heard about the Maya as well, and many other tribes that live in these areas that seem to be pretty advanced and may put up a really intense fight against the Spanish in their modes of conquest. But this man right here does not care, right? This is Hernan Cortez, right? And Cortez is all about one thing: the pursuit of gold, glory, not so much the God part, right? So Hernan Cortez is going to strike out and be the guy that tries to conquest the all very large, very powerful, mighty Aztec Empire, also known in many history books now as the Mexica Empire. And he is going to try to do this using a few hundred men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons. So the thing about it is as you can see, or as you should understand, Cortez doesn't have that much stuff, right? So he's only got a few hundred men. He's got 16 horses, he's got 10 cannons. He's going up against a place called the Mexica Empire, also known as the Aztecs, that their empire is home to several million people, right? So, when you're really looking at the grand scheme of things, his conquest of the Aztecs will demonstrate how the lack of forgeable metals and the lack of large breed domesticated animals definitely affected the growth of the Spanish and their ability to take over some of these other areas, right? Now, looking at the Aztecs in general, the first thing you should understand before we talk about the story whatsoever is the fact that they are phenomenally intelligent, phenomenally advanced. The Aztecs is what I consider the new Rome of the New World, right? The North American version of Rome. That if they just had enough time, they would have been able to grow and expand as large as they possibly could. Now, what you need to do, by the way, really quickly, when we're talking about the Aztecs right now, I'm going to show you some different pictures and stuff like that about the Aztecs. You need to write down about 5 or 6 or 7 key things that I'm saying. Things that basically demonstrate how advanced the Aztecs were for the group of people that they were, for being a tribal organization and a tribal subset of society. So you need to understand that they are actually phenomenally intelligent, because this is very emblematic in their capital city known as Tenochtitlan, right? Tenochtitlan or Tenochtitlan is actually located where current-day Mexico City DF is located. Now, they had over 1 million people in this one city. And the other phenomenally ridiculous part about Tenochtitlan is that it was the capital where the Mexica Empire emanated out of. But then on top of it, it was built it wasn't built out of water. Tenochtitlan was built on top of water, all right? So, I don't think you understand how much this demonstrates the phenomenal intelligence of the Aztec people. But apparently, according to Aztec lore, as well as according to myth as well, the Aztecs actually had this entire thing kind of planned out using their religious structure. So why would a primitive people that don't have a system of forgeable metals, that don't have systems of intense kind of syllabic structured writing, that don't have, well, they do have a writing system, by the way. The Aztecs did have a writing system, so don't kind of look too far into that. But that were considered by some at the time to be kind of primitive. How or why would they choose, and they're not primitive, how or why would they choose to settle on top of water? Well, actually, apparently it's according to an old, story, according to their religion, right? According to their religion, they believed that they would know where to settle in their ancient settling of Tenochtitlan when they saw a very famous symbol. When they witnessed an eagle standing on a cactus, devouring a snake, they would know where to settle their new home and empire. And that symbol of an eagle on a cactus with a snake was seen by the Aztecs in the middle of this giant lake in Mexico, right? So, and they were like, that right there, out there on that island is where we will settle our city, right? And this symbol is current day in the middle of the Mexican flag, right? So, like, that symbol that is so keenly tied to Aztec lore, cultural understandings of the Mexican people as well, is, like, very, very important to the growth and understanding also of the story. So the thing about it, though, is they settled on top of this lake. They had a population of over 1 million people. They also apparently built their city in a series of circles that emanated out. Every time they needed to add more people or more area to live, they would add another circle on the outside of their city. This city was so sophisticated that it had sewage systems, that it had street sweepers that keep the entire religious quarter clean. They had garbage men that would actually like take refuse away. Like they were super sophisticated, much more sophisticated than some very, very intense European societies. And then on top of it, they farmed on top of this lake. That is ridiculous. They literally built man-made islands out of reed and mud to actually stack on top of the lake and make sure that they had the ability to farm on top of it. This is insane. Like, if you actually like want to know how this is made, which I don't care, but I'm going to tell you anyway, these things right here are called Chinampas, right? So Chinampas, a chinampa, right? Chinampas were built by the Aztecs so they could farm and have an easier irrigation system rather than like the Mesopotamians bringing water to you. They just built right on top of the water. So they would take reeds, and these reeds like grew on the sides of the lake, and they were in plentiful amount. And they would weave the reeds together and make these really, really big mats. And then they would put mud on top of the reed mat, and then they would put reed on top of it, and then another like layer of mud, and then another reed mat, and then another layer of mud, and then another reed mat. And they would basically make this big like cake-like thing that floated really, really well on top of the lake water. Now, the problem that you have right now, though, is how do you keep the like island thingy, how do you keep this chinampa from moving around all over the place? They would anchor it into place by planting a tree on the corner. And when they planted this tree on the corner, the roots of the tree would actually come down and grow into the lake, and then grow into the bottom of the lake, into the bottom of the lake, and anchor the chinampa into place. And then they could get out, walk on top of it, and farm all of their goods on top of it that they needed. This helped avoid drought, helped avoid famine, and then as well, you never had to worry about watering your plants because the plants would actually bring water in from the lake as they needed it. Like, what the heck? They're so intelligent. And then on top of all of that, they had a social class system that included priests and warriors, and they actually, interestingly enough, kind of had their own version of feudalism. They had people that were kind of like workers or laborers that like existed underneath these larger societies inside of their entire like cultural scope. And then one of the biggest warrior or classes of people in their like entire social class system was the class of warriors, right? And the class of warriors or their army or military officers were very well known for carrying a very specific type of weapon. Notice the spears that all of these men that are actually in their social classes are holding in their hands. They're made out of a very specific material. So Aztecs would actually make weapons out of lava glass, right? This stuff is called obsidian, right? Obsidian is lava that has been cooled, right? And apparently there were a couple of like volcanoes or active volcanoes nearby the Aztec. And after it had erupted, this lava would actually cool into a very large, like, black layer over top of the dirt. And then they could take this off and chip it down into very, very sharp, razor-sharp pieces of obsidian glass. They would then lay those pieces inside of pieces of wood, making weapons that no one else around them had access to, right? So they were also technologically and militarily more advanced than all the people that lived around them, right? So the Aztecs were the dominant force and the dominant people in the like actual Central American region, of course being rivaled by the Incans and the Aztecs. I'm sorry, but obsidian weapons are so cool. Like so, and they use these weapons to take over a massive amount of area. So as you can see, everything in yellow is actually how much the Aztecs grew. And all of these people are different groups that they actually took over. Now, you'll see as well there's some little blank spots on the inside of it because those are a part of the Aztec alliance systems, right? The Aztecs had this thing known as the Triple Alliance between them and a couple of other larger Native American areas, and then they would use this alliance and these weapons to take over this entire area, right? And so what are they going to do with these people, right? They had to pay tribute, they had to pay taxes, it went back to Tenochtitlan, and it made the Aztecs very powerful and very promising, and they also ended up with a massive amount of gold reserves. Now, there's one other thing they actually took from them as well. Whenever they would beat them in a war, or every year people would have to donate humans to be sacrificed to the Aztec gods. Now, this is something that's really, really intense about the Aztecs. The Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas all participated in at least one or another form of human sacrifice, right? We believe even the Olmecs that actually existed in the current day area, Florida, actually participated in human sacrifice as well. It just seems to be a very common trait of some Central and South American native indigenous people, is that they had some form of human sacrifice. Now, they all did it a little bit differently. The Aztec one is very intense though, right? And they would actually literally cut the person's heart out while it was still beating and raise it up to the gods as a form of offering. And they were offering it to this one god in particular that they actually wanted to prevent from destroying the entire world. They had this one god called Quetzalcoatl, who was like a flying white snake monster who was the destroyer of worlds. And they believed that if they did not offer up human blood and sacrifice to him, that they would actually be destroyed by this god. And after they actually removed the heart out of the body, they would stick it in one of these, a jaguar jar, and they would sometimes, for some religious holidays, sacrifice a large number of people, sometimes over 100. Now, it's so interesting about this one little facet about the Aztec culture is some modern historians are are we sure the Spanish didn't make this up to try and justify them actually conquesting these people? Now, interestingly enough, though, we have unearthed tombs of people that have been sacrificed, and one of them outside of Mexico City had over 8,000 people in it, and most of them were not Aztec, they were from people from neighboring cities nearby. So what is this going to cause, though? Put a little star next to this and make sure that you understand that this is going to cause the people that the Aztec took over, the other natives in Central America, to loathe the Aztecs. They don't like them. They hate them, right? Because they've been taken over by them and they're having to send their own people off to be sacrificed, right? And this apparently is one of the things that the Spanish observed when they got there were these skull racks that they would actually use to keep track of the sacrifices as they went on. So the Aztec faith also was garnered and basically headquartered by this guy, okay? This is their king who was actually ruling over Tenochtitlan when the Spanish arrived. Jot his name down really quick. He's very, very important. It's M-O-C-Te, T-E, Zuma. So Moctezuma, right? Mocte or Montezuma, depending on who you ask or how you want to spell it. You can spell it either way. It might pop up on the test as either or. So if you see Monte or Mocte, it's the exact same thing, okay? But they believe that Moctezuma was an extension of their religion and an extension of a ruling god, right? So the thing about it, getting back to the actual conquest of these people, though, the mission was supposed to be reconnaissance, right? The mission was supposed to be for Hernan Cortez to take several ships, a few hundred men, some horses, and a few cannons for protection, to go over into Mexico and do some reconnaissance, right? And reconnaissance means go over there, find out how many people are there, see if it's dangerous. If it's not, come back, let us know, and then we'll decide to go over there. Well, Cortez was not the most liked guy on the planet. And where they were located or headquartered was in Cuba, right? So the Spanish forts and military was headquartered in Cuba and other islands in the Caribbean after Columbus, of course, originally made landfall there. They're going to start several of their colonies in that area. Now, the thing about it, though, is, again, this is supposed to be reconnaissance. You're not supposed to be going over there and destroying or taking over people. You're supposed to just be going and checking out the things they have. Well, what ends up going on, though, is that Cortez loses the job before he's allowed to go, and they replace him with another officer, but then that officer turns up dead the next morning. Actually, it seems that he's been murdered, and they go to the docks, and the ships that officer was supposed to take on Cortez's mission were gone, and guess who else was gone? Cortez, right? Cortez, though, then lands in what is now modern-day Mexico, and after a series of negotiations and meetings with other native groups and stuff like that, he finds out that the Aztecs, where they're located in Tenochtitlan, how to get there, and he finds out that they have a massive wealth amongst them, right? And so he decides to burn and scuttle his ships in the harbors. He literally burns his own ships because he's like, we're not going back without immense wealth and conquest and glory. So basically what he's trying to do is trying to make up for his insubordination to the governor of Cuba. And he's trying to say, oh, when I return with a plethora amount of money and a huge amount of conquest, you're not going to charge me for doodly squat, right? So Cortez is just like so arrogant. He's awful. And he's like one of the probably like the top 10 worst people in all of history because he's absolutely terrible. So there's another big concept though about these gifts, right? So Cortez, as he's moving through Mexico, you have to understand, he's actually communicating with some of these other natives. The natives that don't like the Aztecs because they have to donate people in the form of human sacrifices to them every few months. Cortez abuses this dissension, and he actually takes it to his advantage, and he begins to recruit them into a small alliance, right? And he's like, oh, if I ever need to accumulate an army to go over and take over the Aztecs, I'll find my people here. And so in that process, he also meets his later mistress and the later mother of his child, Martine. Martine's mother, though, is a native woman. This native woman is actually able to speak Aztec, and she can speak Maya. But the problem is Cortez can't speak Maya. But Cortez, while on his conquest, did meet a disgraced Spanish priest that was exiled out of Cuba and out of the Caribbean by the Spanish, being like, if you want to act that way, go live amongst the natives and blah, 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 blah. Apparently he was like an alcoholic and stuff like that. And so they ship him out over into Mexico. And this guy, this disgraced Spanish priest, learns how to speak Maya. So he can speak Maya in Spanish. So basically, he heads off to Tenochtitlan with 200 men, about 6,000 natives that he's recruited, and 2 interpreters. One of them being like La Mission is like I believe what her name is, and she can speak to the Aztecs and then translate it to the priest, and then the priest can tell Cortez what they're saying, right? And so they head off to Tenochtitlan, and once they get there, Moctezuma actually welcomes them with open arms, right? Moctezuma originally was trying to figure out ways, though, to destroy them, okay? Moctezuma welcomed them with open arms, apparently being like, I've heard about these people. They have these metal guns and weapons and swords and these big beasts that they ride on the backs of, and it's not going to be a good thing for us to try and fight them one-on-one. So Moctezuma, or Montezuma, as you can see, I spelled it differently there, is going to have a meeting with them. And his plan in this meeting is actually to try and see if he can figure out their weaknesses, right? He wants to figure out their weaknesses and be like, all right, maybe they have too few people. Maybe they can't do this. Maybe they can't survive in the wilderness. And he wants to use this meeting to figure that out. But at this meeting, he also gave Cortez a number of gifts. Jaguar pelts, feathers, honey, and a large amount of gold, right? This did not placate Cortez. It made him more greedy, right? It made him have even more zealotry towards them. And he was like, I'm going to destroy you completely. And so Moctezuma is going to actually be taken hostage by the Spanish. And he basically, Cortez tries to rule Tenochtitlan using Moctezuma as a puppet. So what happens is during this meeting, Cortez stands up and literally threatens Moctezuma, and his men take him hostage. And so what Cortez decides to do is leave for a small amount of time and go and try and figure out what the heck is going on in some of these other places he's taken over. They take him hostage, but eventually negotiations break down. And when Cortez comes back, Moctezuma is dead, right? So, like, Moctezuma is already dead, and his men are under threat from the Aztec military and the Aztec that are carrying these obsidian weapons, and they're like, look, if we don't get out of here, they're going to kill us, right? So, like, and why is Moctezuma dead, though? Cortez is like, dude, why is this guy dead? Why'd you let the king of the Aztecs die? And the Spanish soldiers told him, oh, well, we took him out onto this balcony, and, like, we started telling them that they should, like, convert to Christianity and that they should listen to us and they should bring us, like, women and gold and stuff. And then, like, the people down below the balcony were like, our king, who is a god, would never say these things. So this person is either an imposter or he's not truly a god. So apparently, according to the Spanish soldiers that Cortez left behind, they killed Moctezuma by pummeling him with rocks, right? So, like, which is absolutely ridiculous and a terrible way to die. And so now there are other historians that believe that there's a chance that these Spanish soldiers might have actually just killed Moctezuma out of, like, just, like, fear, resentment, or whatever. But the big thing, though, going forward is now that Moctezuma is dead, the Aztec army assembles all of its men together, and they drive the Spanish out completely. The Spanish have to run away. Cortez, with his tail tucked between his legs, has to leave and is in fear of the Aztec and runs off. But what does Cortez have? All of these native allies. He recruits 10,000 more native allies, shows up, and besieges Tenochtitlan for 93 straight days and tries to starve them out. And the other big thing about it is smallpox is running rampant through Tenochtitlan ever since the Spaniards showed up, right? And so because of this intense like scuffle and because of this intense conquest and this fighting, Cortez takes over Tenochtitlan, takes the city, and renames it Mexico City DF. And in the process becomes the very, very first governor of Mexico City. Now, the other big one, though, is that you have to understand that that's like borderline genocide, right? So, like, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's one of the worst events in history. But his cousin is going to do just as much, if not a little bit worse, right? His cousin is a man by the name of Pizarro, okay? Francisco Pizarro. And when they take over the Aztecs in 1519 to 1521, the Spanish begin to hear of another group of people that are settled in the Andes Mountains, right? So and those people are known as the Inca, right? Now, the Inca are culturally very different from the Aztecs. So this is going to be another one of those sections where you put like Inca, and I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures and stuff like that, and we're going to go ahead and talk about a couple of these things, right? Now, what ends up happening with the Inca, though, first and foremost, you know the Inca a little bit already because you've probably seen some of their stuff in a very famous movie known as The Emperor's New Groove, right? You've probably seen some stuff about the Inca and The Emperor's New Groove. I love that movie. I think Kronk is one of the best characters that has ever existed in a Disney movie ever. It's like, I love the part where he talks squirrel, you know what I mean? Where he's like, oh, squeak, squeak, squeaker. Like, now, anyway, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this right here is one of the cities of the Inca, and it's their most famous one. That right there is Machu Picchu. Now, Machu Picchu is their religious capital city. Their actual governmental capital city was located in a place called Cusco, which is the name of the main character in that movie, right? Now, another interesting thing about the Andes Mountains and the Incas in general is that throughout the Andes Mountains and this rugged terrain, write this down, the Incans built over 10,000 miles of trade networks that included hanging bridges, roadways, like rest stops, fresh llamas to be able to use to transport your goods and things like that. So a 10,000-mile long trade network that spans so much area throughout this mountainous terrain. And so on top of that, though, how did they communicate with each other? They didn't even have a written language, right? The Incans had no written language. They actually only had a numbering system, and that number system looked like this, right? Those things right there are called quipus, right? Quipus is actually how Incans kept track of their trade goods using knots and strings, and we have no idea what any of them say, and we have no idea how to translate these different things, but apparently the Incans had a very, very intense numbering system using knots and strings known as quipus, but no written language whatsoever. Then on top of it, also something else you're very, very famous for, the Incans are very famous for, is they did domesticate the only large breed animal that actually lives in South America during this time, and they're called llamas, right? Now, llamas are cousins of a North American camel that apparently used to exist, but actually got hunted into extinction by, early man. But the llama is going to be a big thing for them. Now, really quickly, just to give you a heads up, there's going to be an interesting little part, though, about the llama. Llamas were only used to carry small amounts of goods. Llamas can only carry about 70 to 80 pounds. You can't ride one, right? So they never actually turned into the horses of the beasts or the beasts of burden that horses were back in Europe. The llama actually just kind of ends up being something that they use mainly to make their farming system known as terracing much more effective. This is how the Incans farmed, and I don't understand why I find this particular thing about the Incans so fascinating, but they would literally, because how do you farm on the side of a mountain? you terrace, right? So what they would do is they would dig the land out and flatten it out completely and then stair step it and just basically cut these notches out of the sides of the mountain and create their own fields to farm on. And as you can see right here, these little like roadways, these little like walking areas, the llamas would actually pick up goods and carry them up those little areas, and they would use them as ways to like transport their farm goods back and forth. Now this is another interesting thing about the Incans as well. That right there is an Incan human sacrifice. Now, something you'll notice, something very, very different, though, is like there's no hole where the heart used to be. There's no blood stains. What is going on here, right? The Incans sacrificed children, right? They sacrificed children usually around or under the age of 15, and it was considered a great honor to donate your child to be sacrificed to the Incan gods, right? Literally, your family was considered to be one of the most honorous people if you were donating a child to be sacrificed. And so the thing that would end up happening, though, is a priest would usually take the child up into the mountains, up into the Andes Mountains, to get closer to God, to commune with them, because they believed that children were much closer to God because they were actually alive for less time and exist on that soul ethereal plane earlier than adults did, right? And so they would usually give the child either like coca leaves to chew on or like alcohol possibly to kind of put them in a lucid state, and then the priest would either strangle them to death or beat them to death. Now then they would mummify the remains, because a very, very big thing about Incan faith is that they believed that you cannot tamper or destroy the human body like the Aztecs did by just kicking the dead body down the stairs. The Incans believed that they needed to be preserved. This girl right here is an Incan sacrificial mummy, and I'm not kidding when I tell you that this mummy right here is over 500 years old, and it looks like she's still alive, right? She's one of the 3 children that were actually discovered in 1999 as an Inca, like a group of children that were sacrificed by the Inca. Now, an interesting way that these 3 children were sacrificed, though, is that they were drugged, and then they were put inside of, like, basically a box or a coffin, and then buried underground where they were left to, like, kind of, like, asphyxiate and actually pass out. But the thing about it, though, is their bodies were, like, perfectly preserved in the mountains of the Andes in the cold air, and so basically they're the most preserved human mummified remains that we have in North and South America. Now this is a picture of Pizarro, though. That is the guy that's going to take over the Inca, right? And this is the Incan king. It's very, very important that you jot his name down. His name is Atahualpa. Atahualpa. Now, something that you need to understand too as well before Pizarro ever gets there, the Incans are very, very weak from civil war and disease, right? They actually are having a large-scale war that has broken out in their area, mainly between Atahualpa and his brother, right? And then also on top of it, King Atahualpa had a plan to set a trap for the Spaniards, but it didn't go so well. And we're going to pick up on that plan and the events of that not going so well in class when I see y'all again. Y'all have a good one.